Okay, here's a video lecture for you about thesis statements. Thesis statements are very important in your writing. Not all writing has a thesis statement, but many pieces do, and the kind of writing you're going to do in college usually require a thesis statement. And a thesis statement serves the purpose of stating your point. Your point. Why are you writing? What is the purpose? Perhaps it's an assignment from a professor, or it's something you want to convince somebody of, or it's something you want to present information on in a certain way to your reader. Whatever it is, it's your central point, and there are several elements that go into it. And this lecture is just kind of go in to describe what a thesis statement is, what it does, and then we're going to go through a number of examples that show how a draft of a thesis statement might be improved to be a very good functioning thesis statement. So first of all, what is it? It's a central idea, and it requires supporting evidence. It's something that you state that you cannot assume your reader will understand, nor can you assume your reader will believe it until you have provided supporting evidence of some kind. That could be your research, it could be your reasoning, it could be an argument. But basically you just need to support what you're saying. And if your thesis statement doesn't operate that way or isn't expressed that way as something that requires evidence, then you need to look at it again and revise it and make it a little better. And we'll look at some examples here in a few minutes. It's also something with a scope that is tied to the length of your essay. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, we mean that if you state something that is very broad, requires a lot of evidence, a lot of discussion, a lot of research, and you're going to provide that research in support of your thesis statement and discuss it and subject it to good rational argument and so forth, it needs to be manageable within the length of the writing assignment that you have undertaken, whether it's assigned by a professor or something that you want to do. So if you're trying to cover a thesis statement that would take a book to adequately cover, you really don't want to do that. You want to limit it, bring it down to something in a shorter paper. If you're writing a 10-page paper, you need to bring something to your thesis statement that actually makes that manageable. Same thing for whatever length of assignment that you have to do. But think about that in your thesis statement. Don't make it so broad and unwieldy that you can't handle it in the scope of the assignment that you've been given. So what should it do? What does a good thesis statement do? Well, number one, it answers a question. You don't pose it as a question. You are posing something that answers a question that can be assumed from the expression of your thesis statement. We'll get into showing you that in a bit, but it answers a question. It is not in and of itself a question. So watch out for that. Make sure if you have a question and you think that's your thesis statement that you rethink it so that it is an answer to a question. It can resolve a problem, something that is discerned by you as the writer as a problem facing society, something that needs attention, something that needs people to act upon. It can be stated in terms that resolve a problem. But your thesis statement will make the statement as the solution that you're going to propose, and then you're going to back it up with evidence. It can take a position. If you're writing something that is based on opinion, you're trying to convince somebody of one point of view over another point of view or over alternative points of view, your thesis statement needs to state what that opinion is right off the bat. So what are the criteria for a good thesis statement? We're going to look at these quickly, and then we're going to look at examples that will show you how those criteria apply, and examples that we can kind of pose to you to show a draft thesis statement that actually turns into a better one after we rethink it a little bit. It must require proof or further development. So you state your thesis statement right up at the front of your piece of writing, very often, most often. And then you must kind of look at that thesis statement and say, does this require me to say something else? If it's an act of faith or something that you can't argue or provide evidence for or develop at all, then it's probably not a very good thesis statement. It should be the answer to a question, as we said earlier. So if it doesn't answer a question, it's probably not a good thesis statement. And as we said, the scope should fit the assignment, not be too broad, not be too narrow. And as we said, not be too narrow is the corollary of not being too broad. And not too vague. If you make a general statement that is not clear to the reader what it is you're going to be talking about, well, you've got a very poor thesis statement. Your essay or your piece of writing is not going to develop in a way that the reader is going to understand why you're writing. So let's look at some of these. Here's the first one that we put up there as a criterion. Require proof. It must require proof. So let's say you wrote a thesis statement like this one that we're calling our draft thesis statement here. The first polygraph was developed by Dr. John A. Larson in 1921. Well, it doesn't require any proof. It's simply a statement. So you can't really do anything with that thesis statement except state that. You can't develop it. You can't prove it. But if you were to revise that statement and make it something like this, because the polygraph has not been proved reliable, even under controlled conditions, its use by employers should be banned. Now you can make that statement, and you're going to have to develop that idea. You're going to have to provide some reasoning, some proof. And there you can talk about the deficiencies of a polygraph, talk about the employment situation, and so forth. But this statement requires proof. The first one, that it was developed by a certain individual, didn't require any proof. So this is a much better thesis statement than the first one that we proposed. And we said also that it has to answer a question. It can be the answer to a question. And here's a draft that doesn't really do that. It's a question instead of an answer to a question. Would John F. Kennedy have continued to escalate the war in Vietnam if he had lived? One simple criticism of that kind of thing as a thesis statement would be you could answer it yes or no. And you could have a difference of opinion, but that doesn't really suggest to the reader that you're going to provide any reasoning. You might do it that way, but your thesis statement doesn't indicate to the reader that that's where you're going. If you put your topic here in a different phrasing, in this thesis statement, we can answer the question. It is an answer and not a question. Although John F. Kennedy sent the first American troops to Vietnam before he died, an analysis of his foreign policy suggests that he would not have escalated the war had he lived. So the question of whether Kennedy would have escalated the war had he not been assassinated is answered in this. And of course, as we said before, it requires development, requires proof, but it does answer the question. It isn't the question itself. So your thesis statement needs to be the answer, not the question. We talked about scope. What does scope mean? Well, okay, let's take a look at a draft and see if we can discern a little bit of something about scope. So if we made a thesis statement that said, mapping the human genome has many implications for health and science, well, that's not very broad. It's just, or it is too broad, actually. It's extremely broad. What kind of implications? What, there are many categories. You could have social implications, you could have health implications, and you could devote probably a book to either of those two categories, and there are others that you could consider. So you're not really being sufficiently focused here to address that as your thesis statement, really in any kind of work, book length or two-page paper. So let's see what a revised version of that might look like that might work a little bit better. If you said, although scientists can now detect genetic predisposition for specific diseases, policymakers should establish guidelines about whom to test and under what circumstances. You can deal with that. You can address that. You're talking about the fact that we have the ability to detect genetic predisposition for diseases, but we also point out that what we're going to be talking about as we kind of address this issue or this particular set of facts or circumstances, is that we're talking about policymakers and what they should do in terms of this capability. They should establish guidelines about whom to test and under what circumstances. And it's going to be a very interesting essay. And it's going to be focused and kind of scoped to the point where you can address it and make something meaningful in a reasonable amount of writing. So we talked about narrow. It must be narrow. Narrow enough to address, not too broad. So here's a draft that isn't very narrow. A person who carries a genetic mutation linked to a particular disease might or might not develop that disease. Well, okay, that's just not really, that's just a little too broad. Might or might not develop that disease. It doesn't help us kind of focus. Where is this essay going to go? So if we see a revised version of this, we can see that it's been narrowed considerably. Though positive results in a genetic test do not guarantee that the disease will develop, such results can cause psychological trauma. Genetic testing therefore should therefore be avoided in most cases. So now we're very specific. We're talking about psychological trauma and why this genetic testing situation should be limited in such cases, because we don't want to inflict that on people. So it's a narrower topic. Okay, focused, not too vague. We don't want it to be vague. Here's a vague statement. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial is an interesting structure. Very vague. Where's that essay going? What are you going to be talking about in there? Interesting? Could it be visually interesting? Is it structurally interesting from an artistic standpoint? We don't know. The reader doesn't know where you're going to go with that. So let's see if we can make that a little bit better by revising it. We said, by inviting visitors to see their own reflections in the wall, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial creates a link between the present and the past. There you go. Now that's not vague, it's specific. We're going to be talking about visitors coming to the wall, invited to see their own reflections. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial will create a link between the present and the past. So we're going to talk about something very specific there. Okay, that takes us out to our draft of our PowerPoint lecture here, and that means we've come to the end of this lecture, and hopefully you've learned something about how to construct a good thesis statement so that you are helping the reader understand exactly where you're going, what your main point is. And that will end this lecture.